Pakistan's deadliest air disaster in 2012, Bhoja Air Flight 213, wasn't caused by a single mistake. That night, the pilots, the airline, and even the authorities, everyone was equally responsible for this. The flight was on its first ever route from Karachi to Islamabad, and it was minutes away from landing. But suddenly the flight vanished into a thunderstorm and no one had any clue how. Later, what investigators found inside that cockpit was far more disturbing than anyone expected. As alarms screamed and the first officer begged the captain to pull up, the plane plunged straight toward the ground. The crew had no idea they were flying an aircraft they weren't even trained for. Exactly what happened inside the cockpit that day, and how did Pakistan's aviation authority completely miss it? This is the mysterious tragedy of Bhoja Air Flight 213, which initially started as an exciting comeback story. After more than a decade in limbo, Bhoja Air had returned from the edge of shutting down. It had once been a small but ambitious airline that rose in the early 90s with a single-leased Boeing 737. For a few years, it carried passengers between Karachi, Islamabad, and the Gulf states. But by the year 2000, it had sunk into debt so deep that the United Arab Emirates shut it down for unpaid fees. But even after grounding its planes, Bhoja Air refused to die. Year after year, its owners renewed its operating license, as if waiting for the right moment to return. Finally, in 2011, they made a comeback, and by March 2012, Bhoja Air was finally flying again. They acquired 3 old Boeing 7s from South Africa's Khmer. One of them was built in 1985 for British Airways, re-registered as APBKC. The first month went smooth. Among its planes, APBKC had also flown, but just 69 hours in total, completing 41 flights. Then came the day, 20th of April, the date when Bhoja Air's ambitions would be put to the ultimate test. Flight 213 was bound for a short evening trip from Karachi to Islamabad. This was Bhoja Air's first flight on this route since the company shut down. Everything was going perfectly. In command was 58-year-old Captain Noorullah Afridi, a calm, confident man with more than 10,000 hours of experience. He had flown for the Air Force and later for Shaheen Air before joining Bhoja. His co-pilot was 53-year-old First Officer Javaid Malik, another former Air Force man and close friend of Afridi. Because the two had worked side by side for years, clearly they made a great team. Besides, on board that evening were 121 passengers, including families with small children. Now add 2 pilots and 4 flight attendants too, one of whom was off duty, but sitting in the cockpit jump seat. Everything seemed okay for a smooth 2-hour flight ahead. Except for one thing: the weather. Over northern Pakistan, dark clouds were gathering. Islamabad was covered in storm warnings, and even Lahore, the first alternate landing site, was reporting dust thunderstorms. But Captain Afridi was not worried. When the first officer, Malik, suggested checking Peshawar as another backup, Captain Afridi only said, "No, God will help us." And with that confidence, Bhoja Air Flight 213 lifted off from Karachi Airport at 5:05 in the evening. The cockpit voice recorder started around 6:08 p.m. Inside, the mood was relaxed. Afridi even sang a song, while Malik chuckled at his captain's singing. But on the weather radar, they saw something pilots feared most: a squall line. It's a long, thick band of thunderstorms which was stretching across Islamabad. This line indicates severe turbulence, strong winds, and heavy rain. Still, Afridi didn't turn back. The controller's voice came through requesting them to come down to 20,000 feet from 31,000. So the descent began. The weather radar was already showing areas of heavy rain and turbulence ahead, indicating danger. Malik suggested circling around or approaching from another side. But Afridi hesitated. He said, "Give him a call for permission to change the route." The controller also confirmed what the radar showed and said that there was no clear path west of the city, except a narrow 60-degree gap. And this would fall between the worst parts of the storm. "That is a very small one," Afridi replied, "but let me try that one." But it would be a violation of the aviation rules. The rule says always stay 5 nautical miles away from thunderstorms. But this gap was smaller than that. Still, they pushed forward against the rule. What's interesting was that the Captain Afridi didn't seem worried or tensed at all. He even joked with the off-duty flight attendant in the jump seat, teasing him about his personal stuff. The young man smiled and lit a cigarette while Captain Afridi laughed. By now, Flight 213 was descending toward 5,500 feet. The thunderclouds towered ahead, lightning splitting the darkness, and rain began to hammer loudly on the windscreen. When Malik warned that the storm would intensify after the next turn, Afridi only replied, "Ha ha, now it's becoming dark." He was right. Outside, daylight vanished because of the heavy cloud. But as they descended through 2,500 feet, Afridi accidentally made a mistake. He hit a switch that disconnects the autopilot. Immediately, a sharp alarm blared, then stopped when he reconnected it again. "Oops, what have I done?" he joked, but this time he had tension in his voice. By this time, they were already nearing Islamabad airport, but the controller's radar now showed the storm directly over it. But it was too late to turn around, so they were already lining up for the runway. Malik lowered the landing gear. The wind started to change, first in their favor, but then it went violently against. Naturally, the airspeed increased. The plane's speed became 220 while the safe limit was 190. The instruments were fine. The autothrottle was engaged. Still, the plane was accelerating. But Captain Afridi didn't understand that. He thought the flight was still cutting through the clouds, its nose pointed toward the runway lights, which was barely visible through the rain. But the reality was they were flying into a killer trap. It's called a dangerous microburst, and Bhoja Air Flight 213 was flying straight into its heart, without knowing the consequences. A microburst is like the sky suddenly punching the ground with an extreme blast of wind. Cold, heavy air rushes downward, smashing into the ground and spreading out in all directions like an explosion. It's strong enough to knock planes or trees off balance, because it creates wind shear that changes direction and speed in seconds. A pilot caught inside has almost no time to react. Good thing is that microbursts are rare, but when they strike, they give no warning. And when this flight entered the heart of it, it was already too late. As the aircraft kept descending, the first sign of trouble came with hard jerk. First came a sudden headwind, a strong wind that blows against the direction the plane is moving. And then came the downdraft, a strong current of air moving straight down from the sky toward the ground. Caught inside this chaos, the plane started falling. Wind shear, the warning screamed, and now Captain Afridi froze in fear as the plane dropped almost 1,000 feet. Go around, Malik yelled. Somehow the downdraft eased at that moment, and the plane leveled off. But it was just 900 feet above the ground. Too close to danger, the autopilot disconnected with a harsh alarm. Outside, the storm raged harder. The runway was still far ahead, and the cockpit was filled with panic. But then came another warning. Strangely, neither pilot reacted, but what's worse was that they didn't know Flight 213 had flown straight into a second microburst, and it was stronger than the first. The result? For 15 seconds straight, another violent downdraft smashed them downward. The system shouted again. Afridi pulled back, but he didn't add power. The autothrottle stayed on, but keeping thrust low. So now the plane was fighting both gravity and the machine that's meant to control its speed. Only its nose was up as Captain pulled back. But within seconds, the downdraft vanished and the plane was left in a deadly situation. The plane had low speed, nose up, no downward gust of wind to fight against. Basically, it's the moment before stall. The stick shaker rattled violently. The aircraft's wings were losing lift. Afridi tried to bring the nose down, desperate to stop the stall. But the moment he did, the ground warning returned. So both ways, the fear was the same. Crash. Meanwhile, the tower gave them landing clearance. And their last moments went like this. A voice screamed from the alarm, wind shear. First Officer Malik screamed, "Go around, sir, go around." Captain Afridi tried his best to pull up again, but it was too late for all the 127 souls on board. Flight 213 hit the ground nose first, just outside the village of Islamabad. The impact tore the plane apart. The fuselage exploded into debris, metal, and fire scattering for hundreds of meters. It was over in seconds. The storm drowned the flames, and when rescuers arrived, they found only wreckage, the tail, a section of fuselage, and the broken remains of the flight. All 127 people were dead and burnt. Less than 2 years before, Air Blue Flight 202 had crashed near the same airport, killing 152 people. No one clearly knew how that had happened, because that investigation barely scratched the surface, and now another disaster had struck, one that looked hauntingly similar. But this time, investigators moved quickly. They pulled the black boxes, the cockpit voice recorder, and the flight data recorder and began piecing together the final minutes. The evidence showed what happened, but not why. Flight 213 had entered a thunderstorm, and it had flown through 2 microbursts. It had stalled twice, and both times Captain Afridi had failed to increase power. Not even once did he push the throttles forward. But why? Simulations later proved something shocking that only left everyone in regret. If Captain Afridi had pushed the throttle forward and increased the power just once, the Boeing 737 could have climbed out safely. But he never did. It was a chilling revelation. Every alarm in the cockpit had warned them: wind shear, terrain, stall. But Afridi ignored them all. Why? Not only that, but he also broke every rule of a stabilized approach. He flew too close to the storm. He descended into a lightning cloud, but while descending, he never extended them properly. Even worse, he flew too fast with the flaps in the wrong position. And when the plane truly drifted off course and fell below the glide path, even then he refused to abort. There was no way he overlooked the situation. Because the systems were screaming continuously, the co-pilot was shouting, but still, he pressed on. How did it happen? Investigators started to wonder. What made him take such reckless risks? They discovered that the flight was Bhoja Air's first evening trip between Karachi and Islamabad. It was an inaugural run, and inside the airline, that meant pressure. The plane had to land in Islamabad, and canceling a first flight would look bad. Diverting would, again, look bad. Senior personnel in the airlines are aware of all these pressures. Maybe that's why Afridi didn't want to turn back, but there was something else, something subtle and deadly. In the cockpit recordings, Afridi and Malik could be heard joking, singing, even letting a jump seat passenger light a cigarette. They were friends, comfortable, too relaxed for a flight through storm clouds. Investigators believed that this comfort killed them. Malik trusted his captain completely. He never challenged his judgment, even when the plane screamed warnings in every direction. Still, that didn't explain one thing. How could 2 trained commercial pilots fail to perform a basic wind shear recovery? It was instinctive training for any pilot, yet these 2 froze. Why? As a result, that question made investigators look into Bhoja Air's training program. And what they found there was shocking. When they reviewed the documents, manuals, and simulator sessions, they noticed something strange. The training materials described a Boeing 737-200 as the base model. But the aircraft that crashed was not a simple 737-200. It was a 737-200 Advanced, which was a more complex version fitted with automation. This was similar to the newer 737-300 series. It had an autothrottle, a system that controlled thrust automatically. And the reality was, Afridi and Malik had never been trained to fly it. They didn't even know how it behaved under certain flight conditions. In a critical moment, that ignorance sealed their fate. The passengers must have sensed something was wrong. The lights flickered, the aircraft shook, but inside the cockpit, the pilots believed the autothrottle would protect them. However, in reality, when the storm hit, the autothrottle kept reducing power, doing exactly what it was programmed to do, while the pilots thought it was helping them. Simply put, pilots were fighting the storm, but the plane's system was secretly sabotaging the pilots. When investigators looked over the training program at Bhoja Air, they discovered that Bhoja Air's pilots had never been told what their plane's autothrottle could and couldn't do. And that tiny detail would decide the fate of everyone on board. The report from Pakistan's Civil Aviation Authority came out in January 2015, almost 3 years later, and it blamed the captain for not increasing thrust and the first officer for failing to intervene. But the report itself was full of errors like poor grammar, unclear phrasing, and missing details. And it barely mentioned the one question that mattered most. How did Bhoja Air, a company with just 3 old planes, even get permission to fly again? Yeah, suddenly the airline's comeback was put into a question. But why wasn't it questioned? And by then, Bhoja Air was gone. One of its other planes had been grounded for mechanical issues. And with only one left, it lost its license. The airline stopped flying in May 2012, barely weeks after the crash. But digging deeper, journalists found a number of strange inconsistencies. The CAA claimed it didn't know Bhoja Air was using the 737-200 Advanced, not the base model. But the same CAA had issued that plane's certificate of airworthiness, so how could they not have noticed the difference? Upon more inspection, turned out that the CAA inspector, who was assigned to Bhoja Air certification, had no experience with the 737-200 and hadn't even checked the airline's pilot training program. Some reports hinted at something even darker, that Bhoja Air's approval had been fast-tracked as a political favor. In 2018, another judicial report proved this hint, and it said Bhoja Air had pushed hard for approval, despite being financially weak and lacking proper infrastructure. It also claimed the accident aircraft didn't even have a valid certificate of airworthiness to carry passengers, and the CAA knew it right from the beginning. At the end of the investigation, 9 people, who were mainly Bhoja Air executives and CAA officials, were charged. But interestingly, neither of them was the top names. They might only be the scapegoats, the fall guys. But even stranger, years later, no one knows if any of them were ever convicted. Meanwhile, Pakistan suffered 2 more air disasters after Flight 213. The skies remained unsafe and the same broken systems continued. The government eventually handed over all the accident investigations to an independent body, which was a small step forward, but too late for the souls lost that day. You see, Flight 213 wasn't just an accident. It was the perfect storm of arrogance, ignorance, and corruption. The pilots made fatal mistakes, yes, but they were flying inside a system that had already failed them long before they took off. The microbursts and bad weather only exposed all the corruption that night. And that's the real tragedy, when the people who are meant to protect lives care more about connections and money than safety. Otherwise, what kind of power allows an unfit airline to fly in the first place, entirely compromising with the people's safety? What do you think about this flight disaster? Who would you blame? Is it Captain Afridi, First Officer Malik, Bhoja Airlines top officials and the owner of it? Or the CAA that certified it in the first place and helped in the airline's comeback? What's even worse is the thought that, what if CAA is again certifying another flight or other airlines without checking? What if another airline is still running with compromised pilot training program? What if your next flight's captain hasn't been trained enough? Are you terrified already? Let us know in the comments. If stories like this make you question how safe our skies really are, stay tuned. Because in the world of aviation, every crash hides a truth the authorities don't want you to see.